This is Jeff Harry with Rediscover Your Play. I cause mischief and flip tables at organizations that need that level of trouble. And we have also today...
Me? I'm Maddie. I'm CEO of This Us Now and General Agent of Chaos.
And I'm Lauren Yee. I am a cultivator of curiosity as well as the COO of This Us Now and less chaotic.
And we are exploring mischief, why we cause mischief, what's the purpose of causing mischief, and why mischief is actually needed right now. So anyone can dive in. Why do you cause mischief? And what benefit does it have?
Well, I think as probably the most mischievous person here, is my sense, yeah. Or
probably.
Certainly as a child.
I mean, I would also say real quickly before we super dive in, I'm probably the least chaotic and mischievous in the greater sense of the word. I feel like Maddie might be the most actively mischievous, and maybe Jeff is like accidentally mischievous, sometimes purposefully. But like it's kind of like the middle ground, a little bit of the middle ground.
I really like that framing, Lauren. Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I think mischief is good. I think I liked it as a child because I didn't like being told what to do. And mischief is sort of a not super consequential way to rebel as a youth, where you're sort of like, sneaking little things and breaking little rules. And it's not like you're not hurting anybody. You're just empowering yourself by choosing which rules to follow or not as a child. As an adult, I like mischief because I think making people feel uncomfortable is essential to growth. And mischief is a great tool for that.
I was like, Jeff's muted himself. So
I was like, Jeff, you had a big smile at that. I want to hear.
I was like, say something.
Well, so I have to figure out, like, okay, how do I define mischief, right? It's causing trouble. But I really appreciated, like, Lauren and I ran this workshop and we referred to our workshop in many ways as useful mischief. So like and we referenced Harry Potter, like that dude and his whole group were causing chaos all the time. All those, same thing with like the Scooby-Doo people, like all of those groups, right? The Gummy Bears, the Smurfs, like every cartoon that I reference, like Smurfs used to cause chaos, man. Gummy Bears, I don't know, you didn't see them, Gummy Bears, but they were amazing. And they would take this gummy berry juice, and then just bounce everywhere. Even the Munchie cheese, dude, come on. The Munchie cheese,
one. I did not know you had one.
I know, and my friend Geeta made it for me, and she gave me a little Lego Mountain on that.
That is adorable.
I know she gave this to me a few years ago, but like Munchie cheese, their main job was like to bring happiness, but through like a little mischief. And I think like the mischief is what makes things fun, in my opinion. It makes things exciting. It makes things adventurous, because most people are operating on the meh stage. And if you think about like during the pandemic, what did most people do? They binge watch like Hulu or Netflix or whatever thing that they watch, but they were watching people causing mischief. That's my take on it.
Yeah. I feel like mischief is sort of like joyful disorder.
Yeah.
Where it's like, it's a little bit out of the framework or out of line, but it's like fundamentally not harmful, right? Yeah. It's like, it's meant to be like a little bit edgy, and to sort of push people outside of that meh comfort place. But I think that it's a fine line, right? So like for me, I like to use mischief conversationally in like homogenous spaces, right? So like I like to bring up topics that feel a little mischievous to people, you know. Like to bring up really feminine subjects in really male spaces just to see what people's reactions will be like. But I do think that there's useful mischief. There's mischief that puts people in a position of questioning what they've been accepting. And then there's like harmful, contrarian, jerky mischief
Yeah.
that you have to be like making sure that you're not crossing that line, because like just being like a devil's advocate or whatever, like that's not fun, and the devil doesn't need more advocates. So like that's fine, move on from that. But like pushing people a little bit out of their comfort zone is good. That's a good thing to do, and mischief is a really useful tool in that.
So I feel like I hear all this and I'm like with it, but again, the way that I exist is a little different. But like, okay, so like generally, mischief feels at least loosely negative, like generally speaking. And I think that it doesn't have to be, at least in how we often talk about it, because we almost use mischief as like you're saying, it's like a tool, it's like playful, useful mischief. It's not like I'm gonna be a jerk mischief. And for me, I feel like something that you just said was like pushing a little bit. And I feel like I, being less that, okay, so I am I'm not an only child. I'm an oldest kid, and I have a younger sister. And then like even in my like cousin groups, I was sort of the oldest. I had one older cousin on one side, but by like he was like 12 years older, so it was kind of like not the same. And so I feel like sometimes like firstborn folk or like eldest kids are either like super rule breaker or super not rule breaker. And I think I'm the super not rule breaker type. However, I think that I wasn't and am not necessarily like goody two shoe version of like rules. Like I will question things, but rather than like push, I'm more of the like cautious invite. Like I don't actively like, oh, I'm gonna bring up this topic, but I'll like wade into the waters a little and like shift the conversation slightly, but I'm not just like adjacent. Here's the thing we're talking about, and I'm like, that does not feel natural to me. But I'm not opposed to it.
Yeah, like my sense from my understanding of you is you don't run into conflict. Like I feel like Maddie and I dive into we're like conflict. No, let me head on up. Whoa, right in. Let me just get right up in this piece. Like we kind of like it. Well, I'll just speak for me. I kind of like because there's opportunity in that, right? Like I literally ran a workshop called "Dealing with A-Holes at Work," you know, through play. Like in the name, I'm causing
some mischief.
But again, I think it really ties in really importantly what Maddie said about like not just doing it for the sake of doing it. Doing it for the sake of doing it is being, in my opinion, an a-hole, right? You're just doing it to get attention. You're doing it to feel like superior. I only want to cause mischief in a way of opening up a bigger discussion or a bigger conversation, right? You know, like, ooh, let me talk about, like when I hop on TikTok and I talk about toxic masculinity as a man, like I do want to trigger other dudes to be like, why is this dude defending, you know, divine feminine? That's ridiculous. And then have a discussion with them, because I really feel as if if I'm not bringing it up, I'm like wondering what other men are bringing it up.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's one of the things I think about in the context of like useful mischief is like, what are the power dynamics at play in this space and in this world? We don't exist in some sort of like contextless vacuum. So like everything we say has impact and has impact on different people in different ways. And so like for me, you know, I might feel interested as a white woman pushing white people in my life in sort of playful and mischievous ways, because I recognize that I have that privilege and that power. I also am somebody who has a bit of a masculine energy conversationally. And so in male groups, I don't oftentimes feel like conversationally unsafe, but I know a lot of people do, right? And so like, it's important to be paying attention to like, what is this space? What is the intention of this space? Is this a space for this? That being said, you know, this is mischief to me is sort of like playful, and play at its core is, you know, a low risk way to work through things. And so conversational mischief of sort of like pushing back a little bit, or using sort of playful banter as a way to be like, wait, let's dismantle that thing you just said because we need to talk about that. But in a way that feels sort of fun and like back and forthy.
Yeah.
And not a like, wow, you're a bad person, right? Because like, that's not really effective diving into conflict. That's not effectively creating mischief. That's
Not
just
useful.
It's not
That's
useful,
not useful.
at all.
No.
But like asking somebody why the joke they just made is funny, that's useful. Like being like, wait, I don't get it. Wait, but like, why? Wait, what's the joke? Oh, the joke is that women like stupid things. Oh, okay, I get now. Thank you. Like, that's useful mischief.
I like that because like I am generally pretty curious and I love questions of all kinds because I want to understand. I want to know the bigger picture. Like, if I don't understand where you're coming from, I'm like, okay, well, clearly we're coming at this from different sides. So like, I need a different lens. Tell me more things. And I feel like there's something about, for me, that sort of idea of the questions and the understanding and how we all potentially separately approach this, because you were talking about like playfulness, right? And Jeff and I have run a workshop where we reference your play values as a kid, like informing your play values as an adult. And I was thinking like, okay, like super basic, like yard recess as a kid, like Jeff was talking about, like, we just like run into like chaos because like we're interested and we want to know what's going on. I was like, I mean, I wasn't like super observant only, but I was just like, okay, like what's happening? Where do I want to go? I was much more like, let me assess, not in a take forever way, but like, what's going on? They look like they're having fun. I'm going to go over there. And there's like a little bit more of a pause. And I feel like that is a similar way of how I approach conversations and mischief and any situation as an adult. Hopefully not to my detriment. But I do think also, like, we've joked about this. I've worked with both of y'all, and I've joked about how, like, if I were a superhero sidekick, my name would be Consequence Girl, because I am like not in a no shut it down way. It's like, have you thought about this? Are you concerned about this? Is that okay? What about when this happens? Just because I like big picture want us to like not potentially die or like, you know, have something terrible happen. So I feel like I am the more questioning, wading into the waters to see where we're at version, but like the questions in and of themselves can be usefully mischievous. And I feel like that's my comfort level, and makes a lot of sense to me.
I would put it out there also that I feel what may connect all of us is we all question what's normal. Like, we question whether normal is normal or if normal is even sane, right? And we have like just different versions of it. We're like, do we really want this? Like, are we enjoying this? Because most people operate in like meh, right? Most people operate in a negative like version. And I was just talking about this on a podcast talking about Ted Lasso, and it was just like Ted goes into I guess the first episode, he goes into the press conference and it's all negative. It's all these people that are super negative that frankly have had a mediocre team their entire time, but they're screaming at this guy because he represents mischief, he represents change, he represents like some other perspective, and they're like, we don't want that. We'd rather stay crappy than have change. And I feel like with us, whenever we come into a situation, we're like, oh, it could be better than this. Like, this is not. And then the bigger thing that I think of when I think of Use of Mischief is I really think of, John Lewis's Good Trouble. Because if you take Useful Mischief to the next level, it's just like, well, then we're causing good trouble, which is like, it's painted as bad, but we're actually doing good that's going to be long lasting through this. Like, I'm not just doing this work just for my own entertainment. I'm doing this work because I like don't want people to feel alone,
Yeah. I think there's like a very clear line between mischief and good trouble and civil disobedience on some level of like, I think it's a really important thing in life to be questioning a lot, but especially rules and norms, because a lot of times humans do genuinely very bad things that are fully illegal or fully legal, excuse me. And like, there are times when the rules are not what is right.
Yeah.
And it's important to be practiced in the process of like, wait, why are we doing this? What is the impact of this rule? Because I think we've seen a lot of that lately in this country where it's like, that's not justice. Like, we all see that that is not justice, right? And so like being practiced in the process of being like, this is what the rule is, this is what the norm is, this is what society says. Is this actually what is good? And like, what do I think good is? And how do I stay true to whatever that is? And so in reality, like, I am a pretty ethically rigid person, right? Like, I don't feel very flexible in what I believe right and wrong is, right? It's just that doesn't align with anybody else's rules or laws. It's just mine, right? And so I end up being mischievous because when I think that something is not what is right or is not having the impact that I want to have, I will disregard that thing or actively oppose it. And so like, that's a weird thing because it does involve a lot of self-reflection. And I think, Jeff, what you said is like one of the things that connects us is that like questioning and that self-reflection. Like, yes, people should be self-reflecting. I would say that personally, I do too much self-reflecting. I have a borderline, really disabling amount of self-reflection happening at all times. It is constant and sometimes it is not helpful. But in regards to like mischief and rules and caring about our impact, being really practiced in what your intention is and what your impact is and how those two things connect or sometimes stray from one another is a really valuable thing. It's sometimes very uncomfortable, but that's good. That's kind of how you know you're growing.
There's, I like the idea of like, I mean, mischief has a definition, but in how we're talking about it, it's about like that, the testing of boundaries and questioning, right? That tends to be where it shows up. And I like this idea of like the self-reflection, or at least like knowing your ethics or morals or like what's important to me, not just what is supposed to be important to me. And it made me think of this show on Netflix, Dairy Girls, Derry, Dairy Girls. It's like in Ireland and it's based in the 90s, and there's like teen girls and they go to this like religious school, and there's this one scene that I like really loved. I think it's probably towards the end, but like the unrest that's happening there is that in that current event time frame is like relieved, if you will, and people are like, going to be celebrating, and the whole thing is going to be happening, and the like head lady of the school is like, we will not be canceling school, you will have classes and blah blah blah, and everyone's like, I can't believe that she's doing this, but like they also don't want to get in trouble. But then it comes to that day, and like everybody in that school does not show up except for one girl who's like the rule follower, valedictorian, like I'm gonna get all A's, I'm gonna be the best and get 100 all the time. And the head lady person's like walking the halls and like no one's there, and she like peeks in the classroom and sees this one girl and is like, what are you doing here? Like, why are you here? It's just like, you said that we had school. It's like, you gotta know when to test the boundaries, girl. And I was like, yes, like practice, because we're so practiced at being like, no, follow the rules, and just like sometimes the rules are not good rules to follow, or they're outdated, or the intention is there but the intention versus impact is off. And so I like that idea of like it is boundary testing, but you have to practice and you have to know what you stand for, which is hard, and we're not really told to consider specifically ever in our lives.
Yeah. Well, no, you go.
Well, I was going to say, well, you are now seeing more people causing a certain level of mischief because they are tired of following certain rules, right? And what I mean by that is like they see people that are in power also not following certain rules, and then they tell everyone else they need to follow them. So like an example of that I think of is the whole like Robin Hood GameStop thing from like way back when all of a sudden all these people on Reddit were speculating and like making stocks go up, and then everyone that was making money the standard way was like, you can't do that. And it's just like, what are you talking about? Y'all have always done that. That's what you do all the time. And now we are rating the game just like you are, and you don't like that. And the whole like movement of like cryptocurrency, I don't understand any of it. But again, people leaving the normal route because they're like, this is BS. This does not benefit me at all. And this is why I find this such an exciting time, right? The Great Resignation, freaking people causing mischief, 20.6 million people quitting, right? All the stuff I see on TikTok, like people are just caught, like they'll be posting stuff about their shifts in Amazon and how shady all of the practices on there. On more types of mischief, like people are pushing against the power structures and being like, this stuff is bullshit. It's always been bullshit, and now I want to make sure everyone else knows about it. I love it.
Me too. I feel like mischief is a really useful way to dismantle outdated power structures or oppressive systems in a way that is not like harmful or violent fundamentally. Like I don't see mischief as being those things. I see it as exactly what you're saying, of sort of questioning the norm. And like when we look at the Great Resignation, when we look at GameStop, cryptocurrency, all these things, you know, on some level, it's like a whole group of people got together and was like, but what if we didn't do that and we did this instead? Or like, what if this thing that we accepted, like 2 + 2 = 4, what if it actually equals 5? Let's have that conversation. And the thing is that you can tell that it scares people in power because it foundationally threatens the status quo and existing power structures. And, you know, when all that stuff happened with Robinhood and GameStop, and Robinhood just suspended trading on GameStop or sold people's stuff because basically they were like, well, you signed this contract long ago or whatever it is. You know, on some level, there's a like, oh no, the poors have figured out how to rise. We mustn't let them. And like, that's how you know that it's good mischief, because it's freaking people out. You know, like when you're threatening the status quo into response, that's good. That's good. And I think this country needs that on some level. And I think workplaces need that.
Yeah.
I think that we have accepted some professional norms in the way that we sacrifice our time, our life, our dignity to the idea of work that are harmful. Those are harmful things. And they're making us unwell in a lot of ways. And I'm hopeful that this recent wave of mischief will push us further into a reckoning of our work-related status quo. Like what is the standard? Because what we have currently is not great. It's not working for a lot of people. And we really need to move forward in this way, because it creates like foundational problems for the stability of our country. Like on a personal level, yeah, I want people to enjoy their work. I want people to wake up and not dread their workplace. I want them to feel inspired or empowered, or at worst, neutral about whatever they're spending their day doing. I want them to feel like their basic human dignity is respected at all times. And we're not currently heading in that direction. I feel like we have currently been, and in the last little bit, been heading away from that. And so I'm hoping that we can get more in the direction of like, what are our bare minimum standards for how humans are going to interact with each other in the world, but also especially in work? Like, what do we expect from each other? What do we expect from the corporations, businesses, institutions that we are giving our labor and time and effort and care to? I'm hopeful that mischief is a tool to help us push back and evaluate that.
Yeah, what sparks for me, and then Lauren, I actually want to hear your thoughts on this, but I think of this workshop I attended called Whiteness at Work, and they talked about how white supremacy is designed to make it feel like there's a lack of imagination of what the solutions can be, right? That it's very black and white, and it's very like, there's no other way, right? But what they referenced in Whiteness at Work was they referenced how the way in which we do work now and the way we measure productivity is exactly the same way we used to measure productivity during slave times. Like the same level of like, you have overseers, which are middle managers, you have people that are producing a certain amount of cotton, and they don't really care how you produce it. They just want the most output for the least amount of money or no money. And then they promote people based off that. And we haven't changed that since like 1619. So it's just like the fact that there's a lack of imagination of what another way of doing work could be is really sad.
So in that realm, and in a little bit of the like shift of we want there to be more of this like good mischief that's like kind of happening and gaining momentum, or like not, I don't want to say traction, but just like mainstream, like people seeing other people doing things that are changing the norm or questioning the norm. And whether it's with whatever other trends or what's acceptable in a music industry or in businesses, I feel like we talked briefly about like power dynamics in this, right? So like, does mischief need to come from the bottom or sideways, or can it come from the top? Like if it's top down, is it mischief, or is that like some version of like leadership? Because it's kind of like the questioning people being like, this is like what you said with the GameStop thing of like, this is BS. And then the higher ups being like, you can't do this. And they're like, why not? Or if it is in the work world, like Dan Price, right? Like he's someone with power and he made changes in his organization, but he can't change the other organization. So he's like laterally being like, hey, has anyone questioned and noticed this stuff, but can it only be lateral or from the bottom? Like, what is it from the top, or is it labeled something else? Or like, how can people do, I guess?
I'll say it can come from the top, but if it comes from the top, it's about setting the tone or setting the culture for your organization or your entity, whatever it is you're doing, and then causing other industries to question, whoa, what are they doing? So like Tony Hsieh at Zappos did that when he spent more money giving it to his employees and investing more in his employees than in his customers, right? Dan Price is now doing that with the $70,000 minimum wage, right? Other leaders could do this by like creating a 4-day work week, right? Or like you can work whenever you want to work and you can take your time off. So those are ways in which I feel, but then you have to get buy-in from the whole organization, right? But a lot of times it really does have to come laterally or from the bottom, because those are the people that typically they're ones that are being most exploited. That's where I think why it does come from the bottom.
Well, I also think it's a risky place to be at the top and to try to promote mischief in that way. And the only reason I say that is because people at the top are in a position of power, right? And like fundamentally, you're setting the tone for your company. And so to then be kind of wishy-washy or to push back against it can seem disingenuous or even lacking humility, because you're setting the rules, right? Like you are the person in power. So the people who are maybe questioning the rules are the other people at your company. And so what I think you can do as a leader is not necessarily make mischief yourself, but promote an environment where people feel comfortable being like, why are we doing that? Like, are we just doing that because that's what we did last year? And last year we were like, well, we did it the year before. So, you know, I think that, well, Lauren knows that my theory about this. I think that your impact matters more than your intention. And I think the higher up you get in a company, in a hierarchical company, the less your intention matters in ratio to your impact, right? So like your impact matters more than your intention always. But if you are a person who's on the ground doing the hustle or in middle management or whatever, your capacity for impact is a little bit smaller. As you go up the totem pole and you get higher and higher and higher, the capacity for impact is much greater. And the reality is that people care less about what your intention is. They care a lot more about what your impact is.
Yeah.
And that gets more true the higher up you go. But my feeling is that's why you have the job. You know, you don't get paid more. You don't get a higher salary and more benefits and a nicer title just because you're inherently better than everyone. You get it because you are taking on a greater responsibility for your consequence and impact within this organization. And if you are not taking that seriously and promoting mischief within your own reflection on that role, you're not doing a good job as a leader. You should be questioning yourself. You should be questioning the structures and the institutions and the paradigms that your company uses. You should be questioning that. And you should promote a world in which, and a workplace in which other people question it, and you don't have to agree. You can say, yeah, actually there's this whole other thing, or, that's an interesting question. I think we do it because of this, but let's talk about it. You can have those conversations without making drastic changes. You can promote a workplace where people don't feel trapped in a binary of like, we're either doing this or we're scrapping the whole thing, you know, and you're like, well, wait, like my question was about this last 5%. Like, I don't know that we need to scrap the whole thing, but there's a lot in this world that pushes us into the simplicity of a binary worldview, and Mischief is helpful in pushing us out of that. But I do think that if you're not paying attention to the power dynamics, and if you're not really looking at your role in the hierarchy of whatever organization you're in, it can be misused. And that's like worse than doing nothing. Like if you're gonna do that, do nothing instead.
Yeah, it's like not like, so Mischief in the sense of questioning and boundary pushing does feel like it needs to be from the bottom or sideways. But if you are in a leadership position, like it's not for your staff and your team, it's like for your company in the greater industry or in the whatever. So like it is still bottom up or sideways. So like it can't be top down. Like that's just, I don't know what that is instead, but you can still do that in different ways.
Yeah, it's kind of like a teacher causing mischief in the classroom, and it's just like, well, you're the one you're the leader. Like,
what are you doing?
Why are you taking the kids and like running down the hallway and screaming? Well, it's just what we do, you know. But being that, you know, we all work together at one point, you know, at another organization, you know, I was in a leadership role. I struggled with that. I struggled being able to navigate that because I both wanted to cause mischief, but I also was in a leadership role. I both had power, and I also felt like I didn't have enough power. Like, and it was tough to navigate that and be like, this is, you know, like I remember clear moments when I was like, this is really dumb. We're going to lose someone really good because we're doing something really dumb. And then just like nothing from anyone else. And then I felt like, oh, dude, well, I don't have any power, even though I'm in a leadership role. And I wonder for a lot of people that are in like VP roles or senior manager roles where they want to start stuff, but they feel like they can't, or it's fallen on deaf ears.
Yeah. Well, I think what it comes down to is like consequence, right? So like, and people's comfort level. So like, I was thinking about what you were saying at the very beginning about how you and I are people who are like, conflict? Yes. And Lauren's like, I'll dip a toe in. I'm going to survey the space and see what's happening before I dive on into that. And it reminds me of when we were working with a client and we had shown them a sample of something for some social media content. And we were like, this is just a sample. These are not your colors. This is just sort of the idea behind what one of these looks like. And this woman who we were presenting to just interrupts everyone and goes, drab. That's so drab, like very loud. And almost every person that was in the Zoom call was like, and I grinned because like, for me, I'm like, yes, give me that like really like hard and immediate feelings response of like, I do not like this, you know? And like, I don't take it personally, right? Like I love that people have a strong reaction to things. And so when I see somebody like getting in a fight, I'm like, ooh, oh, what's happening here? Oh, what are we working on? But in the context of workplace environments, that's really complicated, right? Because if you are not the president and you're not like the male guy, you know, you're somewhere in between. You are someone who has power over others and also experiences people having power over you. And Jeff, I know that exact feeling that you're talking about, where you're like, you're having to promote a structure, a paradigm, a process, whatever it is, because like the muckety mucks agreed on it. And in the context of whomever you're talking to, you are a muckety muck. But meanwhile, you're like, no, this is dumb. I do not like this. And it's not useful. And then you have that thing of like, how do you balance that of like creating mischief above, but not creating complete chaos and disorientation below? Because people are looking for you to you for a standard, you know?
Okay, so I love this.
Great question. Great.
And I feel like I don't have an answer, but I do feel like I was like, this is where I like not thrive. I don't know what word I want, but like in the like, okay, let me assess the situation. I was like, this is what they're telling me. This is what this means. So baseline, this is what I need. I know what this looks like here. What, and like for me, when I had those moments of like, ugh, they're telling us to do this, which feels ridiculous, but I'm supposed to tell them. But when I tell them, they're going to be like, this is ridiculous, just like I thought. So what can I do to either do enough to follow rules, but do what needs to happen? And that's the mischief that I like, where I'm like, okay, it's the loopholes. Like I'm not a like goody two shoes, but I'm a rule follower with the loopholes, or like the understanding of like, I'm not gonna like, this is not gonna be catastrophic, but okay, let's be transparent. Let's communicate. I'm gonna be like, I know this sounds real intense and I know that this won't work. So this is what we're gonna do. And this is how we're gonna do it. And then if there's a problem, I will be the person to like shield what's happening. So like, because you do have to be that sort of barrier in between, right? Of like when you are in middle management, middle whatever communication, but at the same time, like the more real and authentic and transparent you can be with either side, I feel like is helpful, because you're like explaining yourself, which is what I do constantly.
So can we make it even more tangible, right? Like, okay, so I'm a middle manager. I get a TPS report that I need to produce, right? I don't need to produce it. I need my staff to produce it. I think it's the dumbest thing on earth. It's such a waste of time. No one reads it, right? My staff thinks it's a dumb thing on earth. They know that no one reads it, but they have to produce it. Now, what can I do from a mischief standpoint to stop this or change this or whatever, when I'm not believing what there is coming down, but also I don't know if I have the power to change something in a large corporation where TPS reports is a very important thing.
Yeah. Well, I think that's kind of the meat of it, right? Because it's about the level of power that you have within a broader structure of power. But it's also sort of about what Lauren was talking about with like trust and communication. And it really comes down to the culture and the climate of your workplace, right? Because you want people to be able to say like, hey, this thing you asked me to do is dumb. It just is. It's a dumb thing to do. It's a dumb way to use my time. It's just dumb.
But that's so not typical.
No, and really like that takes time. You have to build a well of trust.
It takes time and courage.
Yeah. Well, and this is what I'm saying about what leaders can do to help this, is that if you build an environment where people don't feel like it requires courage to give their honest opinion, then you have created a space where mischief can be used and where people can be sort of playful in their risk taking and not feel like they're, if you stick your head out, your neck's gonna get cut, because like that's a feeling I had at an old workplace where I was like, I feel like I'm constantly sticking my neck out. I feel like I'm constantly having these harder conversations. And sometimes it moves the needle, but mostly I just get yelled at or pushback or get told that that's not how business works. And so it is a really challenging thing of like, what do you do to both levels of this when you get something handed down to you that you don't agree with? And I think it's a good time for malicious compliance. Not sure if you're familiar with that phrase, but basically it's this idea of like following the rules to a T to an annoying degree, where it's like, you read the handbook and you're like, these are these specific rules. So those are the rules that I will follow, and be like very particular about it. And as far as like what you promote for your team, I think this is actually a really good way that middle managers can take something annoying off the plate of the people who are doing work on their team.
Mm.
I feel like management in and of itself is work. Absolutely. Managing a good team is work. But part of that is like being the go-between between your team and the people above you. And so if you're finding your team over and over as being like, this one thing that I'm doing is taking up way too much time, or it's like double or triple work. Like, I already did that work. You're making me put it in these 2 spreadsheets, but I already did the work, right? And I would like to spend more of my time doing more of the work, but instead I spend my time putting it in this spreadsheet so that you know I did the work, so that someone above you knows that we all did our work.
Yeah.
And foundationally, that means that you have a workplace that does not have a lot of trust, right? Because people are doing a lot of tasks of just reporting work rather than actual work. But it's also a place where a middle manager can make change. They can either talk about that and be like, this is the money that's generated by their work. This is the time they spend re-reporting their work. It's not a good use of time. It doesn't generate revenue or whatever it is. But also, if you're a middle manager and you have good and active communication with your team, maybe you can fill out that TPS report so they don't have to be doing that. And this is a thing where I feel like ego comes into play, where people feel like, well, that work is beneath me. But if your job is to be a good leader and to provide for your team the best environment and process and flow for them to do their best work, then maybe that's the most helpful thing you can do for them. Because that argument you're having about TPS reports is probably going to take 2 years to change.
Yep.
Like, if it changes, it'll be 2 years. So maybe you just fill them out.
I would even add to that I would figure out a way in which I, as the middle manager, would basically fill it out for them. But then I would utilize that time to track how much more work they got done because they didn't do it. So that eventually when I went to them and be like, hey, these TPS reports are dumb, and everyone's like, yeah, but we need to do them, and be like, well, actually, my staff hasn't been doing it for the last 6 months. I've been doing it. And because of that, they were able to do this work. And then that is like, that has more weight than me just complaining for the sake of complaining.
I like this, that there's sort of 2 sides of the spectrum, and they can be done like from like, there's upper, lower, middle, right? And then there's this malicious compliance versus like useful mischief, what I'm going to call like the loopholes, like, okay, like what's the bare minimum that we need? Like they're almost opposites. And I like that you can kind of figure out what it would be, because it could be either or, and whichever way you choose, or however you can manage that functioning in that way, of either overdoing it because this is what you asked for, so I'm going to overdo and follow it to a T and be like, this is how, like, I spent this many hours doing this thing that you asked me to do, and I'm doing it exactly like you asked me to do. Or okay, let me ask some questions, and like, why do you need this? What do you need from me, and how often? Okay, this is what we need to do. And then either taking it on yourself, or if your team needs to do something for a certain reason, like if you aren't capable of doing that, just being like, okay, look, they want this every week, like literally just put these 3 bullet points and just send it to me. It's fine. Like that's so like the bare minimum or like the maximum. And then either way, whatever is happening, if it comes to we're not getting what we want from the minimum, or we are like, why is your team underperforming? Using the facts. Everything's factual. Like it's like kids in classrooms, right? It's just like, well, they were mean and whatever. It's like, well, why were they, like, what did they say? Like, what happened? Like, what are the facts? So you can just be like, this is what you asked for.
This is the most Lauren, like, what actually happened?
What is,
I could not come up with a more
truth.
clear.
What is the truth?
Yeah, like what is the facts here? And I'm like,
I love these
yes, I love it. I also, it is
Can I throw a wrench in that?
Of course.
What was it? What was the wrench? What was the facts? Okay, come back to me. I forgot it now.
Well,
okay.
I do think that you touched on something that I find to be so useful in regards to creating mischief, and that is data. And Jeff, you touched on it too, of sort of like, here's how many hours we spent, here's how much. There is a reality in business, in workplaces, in the world, that like, if a person comes to you and says, this is my lived experience, and I think that because of that, we should make XYZ changes, somebody's going to be like, oh, this one person told me this thing. And depending on the kind of work environment you have, like, you'll either be like, oh, they informed me of this thing, or it'll be like, oh, that person's a complainer, or whatever it is. If you come to somebody and you say, we spent 600 hours this year doing this thing that we didn't need to do, it has a different effect.
Oh, yeah.
It's also true socially. Recently, in a conversation about Governor Cuomo, former Governor Cuomo, excuse me, a very older white man in a position of power sort of casually said, oh yeah, it's bad, but also like one allegation can really ruin you. And this is a really good time to push back. This is a good way to use mischief, right? Because when somebody says that, you can sort of embrace what they're saying on some level of like, yeah, I think everybody thinks the idea of being accused of something you didn't do feels bad. And I can understand how you, being a white CEO, man, in a position of power, would jump to relating to that perspective, because that's actually like a really natural thing for humans to do, is to put themselves into a story in the logical place and then to sort of look from that perspective. But here's a helpful statistic to help you through that process. You, white male CEO, are 230 times more likely to be sexually assaulted than you are to be accused wrongfully of sexual assault. So when somebody says we need to talk about sexual harassment in the workplace, and when women say this is a pattern, and a man responds with, but one allegation, my thoughts are twofold. The first is, you're at risk too. That's why this conversation needs to happen. Here's a useful data point to remind you that you are at risk too. And two, when women or people who are largely the victim of a certain problem come forth and say, this is a problem, and a man says, but one allegation, it sort of feels like you're trying to learn baseball. And so you go up to a baseball coach and they're like, here's how you win. You just don't hit anywhere where the ball isn't. And you're like, true, yes, but not really the point, right? Like, yes, false allegations are bad. I'm sure that would feel bad to be accused of something that you did not do. And also, you are way more likely to be victimized by sexual assault, 230 times more likely than you are to be wrongfully accused of it. So adjust your paradigm, please, and share this statistic with the other powerful white men in your life. Thank you for coming to my TED Talk.
Well, no, I mean, I think what's really important about that is, figuring out the data points that actually will get people to potentially consider moving the needle, right? When I would talk about dealing with a-holes at work, right, or dealing with toxic people at work, Gary Ware and I would always bring up like $550 million have been lost due to people quitting because of a toxic person just in the last 5 years. That's just for Fortune 500 companies. And that was only people that were willing to admit it, companies that were willing to admit it. So that number's probably higher. When we would say that, and then we would turn to them and be like, how much is it costing you to keep Chad? All of a sudden, like, all that energy gets drained out of their face. Having said that, the wrench that I was going to say is what happens when the data is not enough. Like, a good example of that is I've talked to various organizations and various people at organizations where they've been more productive, more profitable, and overall just more efficient working at home. Company still wants them to come back into the office. What do you do at that point? The data says something. The leadership ignores the data, right? They ignore the 230 times because they're like, hey, I got those allegations were me. So it's, whatever the data is, but I'm feeling this right now, right?
I feel like you kind of touched on this before, and I feel like, so much, like there's individual mischief, but at a certain point, mischief becomes a movement, right?
Hmm?
And you need a first.
Mischief becomes a movement. Let's go.
Like you need noted. There's individual, right? Like I can have like the mischief in conversations or with my boss or whoever. But then if data is not helping you, then you find like cohort, colleague, whoever, people be like, you also have this. And like great resignation style, the people who are like, we're no longer coming into work at this drive-through, and then there's no staff. And then they have to close because they don't want to treat you like a human. They don't want to pay you a minimum wage. And you're just like, I have had enough. And I feel like a big part of the idea of like facts and possibly creating movement is, oh my God, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right?
Hierarchy of needs, yeah.
It is hard, but if you're just like, I just need a freaking paycheck to survive, to make rent and get my kids and have health insurance, I can't cause mischief or I can't cause movement. But if other people, either if someone else says like it's okay and there's like more movement, it's less pressure on just me to show up to this thing. And so there is something about like finding your like mischief team, whoever that might be, but it just because it's like you have to talk to people, like it's about connecting, right?
Yeah.
Connecting with yourself and like, what do I believe in? Connecting with people around you, like, oh, we believe in similar things or not. Interesting. Okay, maybe you want to understand, maybe you don't. But yeah, you aren't always in a space to be able to cause mischief, even if you need, like it needs to happen.
Yeah.
And so the like movement part of it is a big part. Like if facts are on your side, if you can't do it by yourself, like other people are doing this. It's like either in the media or in your company or in your friends or anything. Numbers that are not data, but like numbers that are people power also move the needle.
Right.
Also, when I think about that, then I think of like, what has mischief helped, right? We don't have an 8-hour workday without mischief. We don't have unions. We don't have as many benefits. And I think of like all these different, like the workplace wouldn't be even like, well, I don't know if it's a healthy place yet, but it wouldn't be as healthy as it would, if people hadn't been like, I don't think we should be working 10 to 15 hours, a day. Having said that, I think of other people that have caused mischief in certain industries that almost had to take it and were ostracized because of it in order to, in order for a movement to eventually occur. I reference like Colin Kaepernick, for example, right? Completely causing mischief, completely alone for a long time, for like years, and then got kicked out of the league and then could not get one back. And then years later, all of a sudden, he's embraced. All of a sudden, that whole industry is now supposedly agreeing with him, or at least feigning.
They don't agree with him.
They don't.
They agree. Like, let's be clear about that. Like, they agree with money.
Yes.
And that's what happened there. But I do think that you're both sort of touching on this thing of sort of like, when are you powerful enough or privileged enough to exercise mischief?
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's a really important thing to remember that like a lot of people don't have that luxury. And so like bottom up mischief sort of has to be collective, because otherwise there's too much risk involved.
Yeah.
And I remember having this conversation back at an old workplace where my direct boss, in reference to somebody who worked for me, said, well, if she doesn't like it, she can quit.
Mm-hmm.
And I turned to her and I was like, what's your understanding of people's lives that they can just quit their jobs? Like, quitting is unfortunately a luxury that a lot of people cannot afford. And we know that statistically speaking, most people in this country can't afford a $400 expense. So the idea that somebody can just be like, I don't care for this, mischief managed, I'm out, like that's not a thing. That's not a thing. People, because of the hierarchy of needs,
Yeah.
like people don't have that space to do that. So it has to be collective because otherwise it's just too consequential.
In like a very processed logic formula brain way, I've framed something with Jeff before, which like is not anything new, but like so much of the choices we make, at least especially within business, but also personally, are based off of the spending of time, money, and effort. And I feel like with the hierarchy of needs and the privilege of being able to make those choices is also the added formula of your values. Because like, I don't have time, money, or effort to spend on this, but if it is heavily weighing on my values, maybe I'm going to suffer those consequences of spending more time and effort and losing money because this is so important to me. So like that self-reflective part that we kind of started at the very beginning of like knowing like, what do I stand for? Which makes me think of Hamilton. And like, if you stand for nothing, what do you fall for? Like, what do you stand for? Like, what's important to you? Like, what do you value for yourself? Or what do you want for others? Or what do you require in your environment? Like trying to be aware of that. And that might change and that's fine. But like trying to be aware of that can really sort of help you assess what level of mischief or you're willing to do or interested in, or like gonna go run into the chaos if you want or don't want or can't. But I feel like it's like that formula of like all these things kind of coming together. Like maybe now's not the time. Maybe it's like a super busy time of year. Like I don't know, health insurances are doing things and like money and taxis, like there's certain literally just cyclic times that are like not great times, personally, professionally, whatever. And you have to assess that for yourself based off of your values.
Yeah. It goes back for me to the whole idea of the great resignation or great attrition or great reawakening or however you want to describe it. But I really love how Robert Reich refers to it as it's an unofficial general strike, right? That there's a whole group of people that were like, this ain't working. Like just the structure of all this, that I'm supposed to work 40 hours a week or more for 50 years so that you can give me 10 or 15 years of retirement money. And the whole time I'm making you rich. Like, I don't even understand why that I agree to that. I never agreed to that. How did I get here? Right. So really then challenging what we've considered the norm for so long, I think is, I don't know how to say it. It's just like, I think it's so important, but also really scary because if you think about it, what was it? 60% of those people that quit did not have a job lined up. Like that's how bad it got. Like during a pandemic where you might not get unemployment, people still were leaving, and then that when people received unemployment, it was only like a couple $100 a week, right? $300 or $400 a week. And that alone made the house of cards fall because jobs were so crappy or companies were so crappy. So it just shows how toxic and unhealthy the current work environment is. So then I'm like wondering then why is it even possible to change the work environment now? Because we have two different points of view. You have the employer that doesn't want to change, and the employee that is just like, I can't tolerate that type of BS anymore.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is where we run into a way in which our society and our brains are not helpful to us, which is that we try to simplify things into a binary typically of like us or them. Maybe sometimes we allow for a little bit more nuance, but not really. Usually we look at things and we're like, it's good or bad. You're an employer or an employee, which means you have this perspective or that perspective. And really, like, I think that there is a lot of space for the messy in between. And I genuinely believe that the messy in between and embracing that is where progress can be found. And I think that it takes a lot of different things coming together. There's a real practical inconvenience to having all your employees quit. At a certain point, you gotta let it reflect on your workplace, right? Like, you got to, because like people don't put themselves into financially insecure situations for no reason. Right. In the same way that people don't like cling to the back of a train to escape their country for no reason, right? Like, people have to be driven to these places. And presumably your employees wanted to work there when they applied for the job and got hired. So something happened in between there. And I think one of the things that's really helpful, aside from data and having sort of an open work environment where people can be honest, is really embracing the boo. And this is a really unpopular thing, my campaign for increased booing. It's an unpopular thing in the workplace and in public, but I think that it needs to happen more. And here's my reasoning. First off, in public, we should be booing more. When you see people mistreating other people, when you see somebody being rude to a customer service person, boo, loud booing, boo, universal negative boo.
Especially now when everyone's being so
like, right. We cannot allow for our society to descend into like, oh, isn't it crazy that some people act like that? No, ostracize them, boo, boo. So publicly, I'm leading a campaign for more booing, but professionally, I think that there is toxic positivity in a lot of progressive workplaces that promotes a world in which everyone loves every part of their job. And like, that is just trash, right? That is trash. And we know it's trash. And really it's like an emperor's new clothes style lie that we allow to continue in the workplace, when really what happens is people just break. They break under the pressure of being perfect. They break under the lies they've had to tell because they are not perfect. They break because that is an unrealistic standard to have. We are not going to be happy and good all the time. We're not going to like every part of our job. I think that it should be okay to say, I really don't like this part of my job. It doesn't mean that you're absolved of that responsibility, but it is okay to be like, I don't enjoy this. This is not my cup of tea. Or I had an interaction recently that I did not enjoy, right? And those conversations of like really embracing the boo, of like, no, I don't care for this. This is a bad use of my time. Or we keep having these meetings and every time at the end of them, I feel stressed and like my battery is empty and not motivated. Like, those conversations should happen without people getting labeled as problematic or complaining. Because when we ask for perfection, when we expect perfection, we're asking to be lied to. That's what it is.
Yes.
That's all that it is, because we know that people aren't perfect. And it drives me nuts in workplaces. It drives me nuts every election cycle. Let's stop with this. Like, people are flawed. They make mistakes. They have things they like and they don't like. Like, can we be a little more honest and nuanced about that without the idea of somebody being like, I don't like this part of my job, and somebody interpreting that as being, well, they've said they're no longer going to do TPS reports. And it's like, no, they just said they don't like it. Like, that's an okay thing to do. And I think this is where leadership can really play an important role. Like, share your boos, share the things that make you feel boo. That's good. Model that behavior so that the people around you can behave in that way also. Because that's how you're going to develop that well of trust that allows for somebody to be like, hey, I don't think this is a good use of my time, but I actually thought about it. And if we do this other thing, we're going to like have double the time and half the amount of stuff to do. And that idea doesn't come until they can first have that conversation of being like, I don't like this.
Yeah.
And right now, we don't really accept that in the corporate professional world, like not liking things. It's not really allowed.
I want to say a thing real quick of just like in that statement, I do agree that like that feels like I mean, maybe people will have versions of boo if they're not going to like literally boo people, but there's like, that's like not okay. You know, like
Yeah.
that's like a very subtle way to like start to move the needle in the sense of like what is allowed or the norm. Like nobody said anything. So that's just how that is. But if someone's like, boo, that sucks. You're like, I agree. Like, I also agree. But I think that, oh my gosh, I'm gonna lose. I was like, I don't have a wrench, but I was like, I'm gonna lose the train, whatever was happening. I feel like there's something with, I don't know how to say that. I don't know how to come back to the phrasing. I've lost the phrasing. I'm gonna go with Jeff, and then I'll come back to this.
Okay. Well, hopefully
We'll see.
First off, embrace the boo. I love it. You need to do a whole talk on that. That's a talk there. That's fascinating. Embrace the boo. I would love to go to that talk. But what came up for me is the acronym for NICE, in the workplace. Nothing interesting can emerge, right? We're way too nice. And because we're being way too nice, because that's the culture, right? That we can't get to any of the good stuff. We can't get to any of the change that needs to be addressed because we're all trying to be, what you said earlier, perfect. And whenever I hear someone now saying, my friend Angie Cole brought this up to me, that I was like, oh my gosh. But she's like, whenever I hear the term like recovering perfectionist, right? The idea of perfectionist, if you think of like what a perfectionist is, their main goal is to look for problems within everybody and within themselves. What kind of horrible lens is that at no time can you ever see something as good, because if it's not perfect, that person is wrong or I'm wrong. And it's just like, that's a horrible life to live in. That's a horrible culture to live in, because then you're literally walking on eggshells all the time. How can any work actually get done? But that is what most workplaces right now currently support, a perfectionist type of work ethic, which is crazy. It's just maddening.
Yeah. Something that you said was close to maybe where I was thinking before, but I feel like it's there's so much, I don't know if it's in white supremacist culture necessarily, but like in the perfection thing, and with when like honesty doesn't have to mean negative, you're a problem things, but I feel like so often people push a problem. Like you can not be a perfectionist and have high standards, but be understanding. But if you also are doing like the like, oh yeah, like this was really hard for me, like that doesn't mean like, oh, they can't do their job. But that's like where people's brains go to. Like people go to like skyrocket off the charts when there's like something that's bad or a problem or not, like if it doesn't fit in to what they think the assumed structure is. And I say assumed structure because we've seen it's more fragile than many people assumed, that like if it doesn't fit in that, we're just like, oh, it's bad. Oh, they can't do it. They can't handle it. This isn't perfect. Like now I have to look at everything they've ever done. You're like, no, let's calm down for a second and just like assess the situation. Like Mischief should be smaller.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like so many things tend to get like, I don't know if it's like blown out of proportion or just like hyperized. There's a word, hyperbole. There's a word I want. But it's just like, it doesn't, you can do things in a small way. It doesn't have to be 100% or 0. You could do a little bit regularly, like just like, oh, like that's Like, that's an interesting thought. Like, even saying that in a meeting is so small, but like is like a starting point of like letting somebody say something unexpected.
Yeah.
But people feel like they have to make sweeping changes, or when someone brings something up, it's a huge problem, and you're like, no, like it doesn't have to be, but you're making it that way, and it makes it way harder.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's because we like to simplify things. Like humans as creatures, as brains, like to simplify things because we don't have very advanced like parallel processing in our brain. So the idea that something can be both good and bad at the same time is like disconcerting, right? Like we have a hard time with that. And so we basically deny progress of any sort because it will force us to deal with that of like, hey, there
Messy.
are good stuff here, there's also bad stuff here, and we need to sort of do the like mucking around work that's uncomfortable and hard to deal with and sometimes makes us feel bad, in order to dismantle that stuff. And I think there is a lot to be said for the role of niceness and perfectionism, especially in the workplace, upholding racist and misogynist systems, because the discomfort of getting to the bottom of it and of dealing with the fact that like, there's this feeling of like, what are we just going to cancel everyone?
Mm-hmm.
And you're like, no. Yeah, that's the extreme of like, it's not that this person is universally good and this person is universally bad. It's that we're all both and we're all just trying to sort of navigate that. And we need to become practiced in evaluating our impact, paying attention to when it's strayed from our intention,
Mm-hmm.
and being practiced in redemption. Right? Because in order to dismantle a perfectionist worldview, we must embrace a forgiving worldview.
Yeah.
Right? That's the only real way to do it because we're never going to be perfect. Humans are nuanced and complicated and come in all sorts of varieties. It's what makes them so great, right? But it also means that like anytime that we make these extremely binary promises of like, yes, this is what the job is, and I will execute it 100% every day. That's a lie. That is a lie. Nobody should be expecting you to do that. And you should not be saying you're going to do that.
Yeah.
But in reality, you kind of have to because you need to get that job. And so if you're in a position of power, like, do this work of dismantling that binary. Create a space where you can say in a job interview, okay, so you've read the job description. Like, which part of this do you think you'll enjoy least? Like, have that conversation so that you can start your professional relationship in a world that includes nuance and variety and doesn't uphold the systems that oppress us through forcing everybody into these perfectionist paradigms because they just don't work. Like, it's just a lie. And that's why when I always say like it's an emperor's new clothes style lie, like it's just the biggest collective lie.
Yeah.
Like, why are we doing this?
Well, I mean, we're partly doing this because this is part of white supremacy, right? Like that's one of the most important characteristics of white supremacy, perfectionism and then rugged individualism. And I guess this ties in with like, what I would be telling a lot of leaders is really also then looking at your leadership style. Not only should you figure out how to navigate in the gray space, but how many of your traits are masculine leadership traits and how many of your traits are feminine leadership traits? We've so much for so long celebrated, the Steve Jobs and the Elon Musk's and all these toxic dudes that were very decisive, very competitive, very individualistic. And I feel if we want to evolve, if we want work to evolve, we really do have to embrace more feminine leadership traits of like intuition, playful, collaborative, empathetic. Like it's what you said earlier, just like, where's the forgiveness? Where's the understanding? Where is that where is that even cultivated? Where is that even listed in the values of the organization, right? And as long as we are so pushed to what I consider a more toxic masculine, leadership like paradigm, we're not going to get there.
Yeah.
I feel like so much of this comes back to the so much of your choice, being able to make choices, still comes down to being aware enough of yourself to know your value, your values, what you stand for. Because if you, like we talked about, like the perfectionist mindset that everything has to be exactly at 100% or it's bad. And Maddie, you'd mentioned the sort of like, we need to have space for forgiveness, but it's kind of like a chicken or the egg thing, right? Like, do you need to create a space for forgiveness or a place where you're going to fess up to making a mistake? Because you do that if you're not going to get forgiven. But if you, again, like, what you stand for, and like, I want to say I made this mistake, but if you're confident in what you stood for or why you made that choice, I'm confident in my choice. I'm also, again, with the mistakes and thing, like, we have to be willing to learn generally. But like, if you're like, I made this choice because XYZ and it made sense with the resources I have, the knowledge I have, the experiences that I had, and now you're like yelling at me that it's wrong. Like, if I'm confident in where I was before, like, I can assess and be like, okay, now I have new information, and like this was not the best interaction, but now I have new information. But if you're just like, I made a choice and I didn't think it through, and like, just because someone told me, like, that interaction will also not feel good. If you're just like, oh, well, like, we just always did it this way, and so I did it this way, but now you're yelling at me, and like, you have nothing to sort of stand on. So it's like knowing your values and being able to stand and make choices on your values, your time, your money, and your effort, because in whatever ways, then you can be confident in your choices to stay or not stay, or cause a little mischief, or choose to stay quiet sometimes because it's not worth it, or whatever you want to do. But you have to know enough of those things to be able to actively do, otherwise you're just kind of coasting in it, right?
Yeah. Well, and I think a lot of people are coasting in it. I think
because we get like, we have to sometimes.
It's a lot easier to coast. I mean, like, it's not fun being a person who like, speaks up all the time. That's not a fun thing. It's exhausting, and too often it falls on the shoulders of people who are the ones being negatively impacted, or in the case of like race, gender, like the ones being actively oppressed, having to do this like heavy lifting of like, hey, here's why that thing that you said is really problematic. And you're like, it's tiring. It's tiring. And I hope that like people who are in positions of power recognize that like those conversations are more exhausting for the person who has less power, right? Because they are taking a greater risk. And if you see an employee of yours modeling tough conversations, please embrace that, even if it's something you're still learning. Because I've had the experience of going into a room of people who are senior to me, like trying to model the vulnerability of being like, hey, this happened. It was a mistake. And because of that, someone was harmed. And I'd like to have that conversation here to talk about how we ended up here and what we can do differently. And like, here's what my role is in it. Would anyone else like to speak? Silence. Silence. And like that moment, I like an essential tether of trust and faith in the organization that I was working with broke. Because what I saw is people who had much less to risk than myself being unwilling to take responsibility for the role that they played in something that was objectively harmful. Like, you have to be able to own that. You really have to. Otherwise, you're not growing as a person and you're not a good leader. And if you see somebody who works for you doing that and you don't step up to that plate, like, you shouldn't be making more money than them. Like, not to be rude, but like,
Like-
my feeling is sort of like, in order to be a good leader, you need to have values, you need to have vision, and you need to have backbone. And so if you can't stand in a room and say, hey, this was a thing that happened, I thought it would go this way, it went another way, and it was the wrong choice. Like, if you really can't own that, then you have no business being a leader. Like, get out of the room. Leave.
Ooh, side note, leaders do not have to have titles to be leaders, which I feel like we've kind of used that reference, or it's like said like leadership and stuff like that. And in the use of like mischief and movements and all this stuff, and like what you can do individually or like from top down, bottom up, whatever, like you can have leadership or influence, or not always like power in the way of making a lot of change, but more power than you think you might have sometimes. And I feel like more people need to know that. Or I think people are starting to realize that more now as well. But
I almost feel from my experience and the people that I've interacted with, when I meet senior managers or VP level or middle managers that are supposedly considered leaders, they're usually the least courageous. They've been promoted because they were willing to toe the line, right? And I hear you. I completely agree. You need to go. But think about so many organizations where that is the leadership, right? What do you do in those situations? Because you now have all these people that are all towing the line, sometimes exhibiting even cowardice, right? And willing to not say anything just to keep their head down, just so they can collect their paycheck, knowing that they're not really making a difference. But that's why I'm here to just, not get fired, right?
they're not mischief folk.
I do think that like there needs to be space for people to have casual relationships with their employment, right? Like, it's okay to have a job where what you want to do is show up and make your money and leave. Like, that is an okay thing to want. It's okay to prioritize other parts of your life. But as you go up a ladder hierarchically, you have to be paying attention to your impact. Because if you just showing up and doing your job on like some base level is perpetuating something that makes the jobs of everyone beneath you worse, like, what are you doing? And this is where I think there's a real sort of old world, new world style around work that needs to be addressed, where like seniority plays a crazy huge role. And it's like, no, you also have to be like working towards something that is more or better or different or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And this thing of like, I'm just going to camp out here. Like, I find the data around it, I find HR data and attrition data to be incredibly interesting. And it's interesting because it has to do with how humans make choices, and they're complicated, and there's a lot of variables. But if you're looking at a company and you're just saying like on its face, how can I tell whether or not this is a company that is interested in growth? And I don't mean revenue growth, I mean organizational growth. I would look at the average tenure of the people at your company.
Mm-hmm.
Because one of the things you may find is you're like, oh, it's like 5 years, that's reasonable. But then when you dig down in the data, what you see is actually 10 people have stayed for 12 to 15 years, and everyone else stays for 1 to 2 years. What does that say, really? Like, and again, like people are complicated. It could say a lot of different things. But if you as an organization aren't asking yourself these questions of like, hey, this person appears to be camped out in this role, are they actually doing a good job? Or is it just they reached the point at which they were gonna stop doing new stuff, and it was at this company, and that's what they're doing? And I do feel like companies where the people who are in the room making the decisions are the same 8 people all the time, like, you all should be reflecting on that and asking yourself tough questions, because I think that you may find just like a high degree of complacency, not people who are super practiced in their job or extra expert at what they do. It's people who are like, I've figured out the middle ground that works for me and I'm not going to push past this. And you know, that's fine if they're not having a negative impact. If they're not going to push past it and the end result is that everybody else's work suffers, then that's not fine.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think that a lot of corporations or businesses are comfortable having that conversation, is the truth. And I do think that a lot of places recognize that amongst those 8 people is a crazy amount of institutional memory. And this idea of like, if we got rid of Bobby, like, you know, he manages the whole database, we wouldn't even know what to do. And it's like, Bobby's trash. Bobby's bad at his job. Bobby makes his female colleagues feel uncomfortable. Why are we allowing for Bobby still? And well, no one really understands what he does. And he seems to manage a lot of the spreadsheets. And it's like, okay, y'all don't want to do the work to be better.
Right.
And like, I guess in the spirit of being honest about booze and like companies being honest, I don't like when companies disingenuously engage in culture workshops or DEI workshops or things ostensibly to make people like working there more, when they're not willing to consider that maybe you need to fire somebody, or maybe you need to make less money next quarter, or maybe you need to slow down. Like, that's not really what businesses like to hear. And so you end up in this position where they're just sort of inauthentically pretending that they care about you. And honestly, that pisses people off more.
Mm-hmm.
Like, at that point, everybody would rather you just be like, yeah, that's Bobby. He sucks. Work around him. You know what I mean?
At least it's honest.
Right. Like,
At least
don't
it's
pretend
honest. At least it's
that
honest.
he's not crappy. Right. And like, this is where we end up with workplaces where like, you know, do they want to have these conversations? If at the end of this conversation, they have to contemplate firing somebody or making less money?
Yep.
Probably not.
I feel like so much of it is, I mean, like the thing that we all, and I feel like many people agree on or understand or want, is it's about progress, doing better, making change, moving forward. Time moves forward, like we gotta do that as well. But a lot of the expectation in business is to maintain, right? Like you can't like get a bunch of revenue and profits and then like go down at some point. Like what happened? You're like, a year, just a random year, I don't know, but like you can't, like there's no level of okayness of that happening. And so what happens is like once you get to a position at that sort of like board meeting room, VP whatever, it's we just got to maintain, we just can't go down, we just can't go backwards, we just have to be here. We don't want like whatever for forward because we just don't want to mess this up. But like, that's not what anybody else wants. Everybody else wants forward movement, change, progress, better. But it's like too much.
Yeah, and I would argue that actually it's an incredibly short-sighted perspective for companies and leaders to have.
Yes.
Because really, you know, what you want is people who are excited to do their best work for you. And the more that you ignore these problems and you focus on sort of this like fear-based production of whatever revenue, whatever it is, everybody just work around Bobby, like the more you end up alienating the really good employees, the ones who actually want to have an investment and feel ownership and be empowered. If companies are not willing to have these conversations and make these short-term changes that may result in a little bit of chaos and a little bit less money for the next quarter or two, then they should get really comfortable with the Great Resignation. Mm-hmm. Because that's where we're at. Like people don't want this anymore. They don't want to miss their whole lives with their family and spend their whole life in traffic so that they can barely break even on their monthly expenses.
Mhm.
Like, people don't want this anymore. So take this messy time as an opportunity to have those conversations and slow down and make less money and fire the problems, and build a workplace where you're confident that every individual that's there wants to be there and is bringing their good work every day, most days, let's be realistic. You know, that is what you really want. Create that work environment before it becomes problematic. And here's the thing, it always becomes problematic.
Yeah.
You know that somebody's going to sue your company because you had a toxic work environment because of Bobby. And everybody's known that Bobby was a problem for 10 years. And now you're suffering consequences, and now you're being pushed into change, but begrudgingly, after the fact, after you've gotten punished.
But
Like,
also it's like
pointless.
and that's where the like trying to like assess whatever, I mean, like I know we started with mischief, but it's just also like mischief and like risk feel very similar, right? And so like if you're trying to assess the level of risk now of like, well, if we get rid of Bobby, like we have to find somebody new, we have to have them like learn the whole system, like it's going to take so much time and effort, but then it's like, but also the amount of money in a decade into the future is like more, like they have more knowledge, it's going to take more time, it's going to be way more expensive when there's like lawsuits.
Yep.
Like there's more people involved, like we could have like saved all of this time, money, effort, human decency, like all it costs so much more when you wait.
Yeah.
Like yes,
There's
it's hard, it's only going to get harder.
Well, also there's actually risk in not taking the risk, right?
Right.
It's just, and it's what you said earlier, right? Is like, you now are finding out how toxic your organization is based off of this time period that's happening. But I think a lot of companies don't realize that. I think a lot of companies are waiting for people to finish the Great Resignation and then come back and start working again.
Oh, like it's almost like, are you done having your tantrum?
Are you done having your tantrum, little child?
No.
And the problem is what they don't realize is these Gen Zers, man. I mean, and heck, even millennials and Gen Xers are like ready to go as soon as they arrive. Like, I don't think they realize if they haven't cleaned up their own house and put their stuff in order, then it's just going to be a rotating, turnstile of people coming in and out until they actually address their situation. And then what will eventually happen, is they'll either become irrelevant, like a Sears, where they're still around, but not really around, or just become obsolete. Like some companies that think are doing well right now are going to be gone, like Blockbuster. And I don't think they realize what they're risking. I think they think they're just untouchable. So having said that, and as we come to the close of wrapping up this, here's the question I have for both of you is, what would you say to someone that is in a middle management type role, wants to cause mischief, feels like has a certain amount of power, but not that much power? What advice would you be giving to them right now during this crazy time that we are in?
I think
Stuff that you haven't already shared, obviously. Right?
Yeah, I think my advice is probably twofold, and it's first off, like, read all of the documents and the policies and the handbook at your workplace. Really know what the rules are, because sometimes in the process of doing that, you find out that something your manager has been doing to you for 2.5 years is expressly forbidden, right? And like, there's a basic level of like, hey, so I actually just read the handbook and it told me this other set of things that is the opposite of how we do things. So first off, do that. And that's true of any organization you're a part of, any club you're a part of, anything you're doing. Really read the policy books, read the founding documents, read all of their primary sources as an institution, because it's a lot easier to create mischief when you can come back with the primary source reference. Like that's always a really great place to go. And then the other thing is like, pay attention to who the people are in your workplace that seem like-minded or equally excited by the prospect of mischief. Like when we talk about like, who's your mischief group, we were the mischief group at our last company. Like we were the ones that were sort of like, how can we do better at this? What if we did this differently? And like, yes, that resulted in a lot of extra work for us all the time. But also, you know, those are the people that are going to help you and be your coalition in the process of trying to make change. And they may also be your people outside of that institution, right? Because now we continue our band of mischievous people together, right? Like we are the mischief committee, and like we continue that outside of this workplace in like professional development workshops, in founding companies, just existing in society. And like Lauren and I oftentimes joke about how it's so funny that we work together at all, because realistically we shouldn't have. We were as far as humanly possible as two people could be. We didn't have the same job. We didn't work in the same regions. There was literally nothing about us
no overlap
that had overlap. And we just continually were like, let's work on this thing together. What if we do this thing together? Right. And that's how you find your people is like, oh, you're down for a little mischief. All right. You want to be a little uncomfortable. Okay. And like, that's the thing. Get your primary sources, read your founding documents, figure out what the actual structure and paradigm of your workplace is supposed to be, and then find your allies and do it quietly. Quiet, right? Like, as a rule, especially if you're new somewhere, like walking in and being like, here's how you do stuff. This needs to change. Like, people don't like that. There are existing relationships there. It shows a real lack of respect for any work that came before you, even if that work is not great, or even if you think it could be better. It doesn't matter. There's a whole world that existed before you, right? So find your people, do it slowly, and find it quietly, right? Like, know who the ones are that are going to stand up in a boardroom and say, like, actually, that thing you said is problematic, and I want to say that. You know, those are your people. Hold them close. You never know who you're going to start a business with later.
I will, in addition to those things, I feel like I want to go with just the idea of like mischief is about forward movement, right? So I think that for yourself, whatever position you're in, or I guess if we're going like middle management, like what deciding where you want to have your impact. And if it is like, I want to create a great, strong team specifically, then like, okay, like not that I don't care about leadership, because you have to, like, but like, how can I function within that with like structural paradigm, like written handbook knowledge? But like, I'm going to invest my time in my team, and how do I focus on that? Or is it about like, not that you don't care about your team, but is it about like pushing a initiative within the organization? Like, and if that's what you want to do, like figuring out like where you want to have the forward movement in what, like growing a team, to having an initiative. Do I want to change the way that we do a certain practice, like I don't know, evaluations? Like, where do you want to make change? Where do you want to put your mischievous efforts? And within that, kind of like finding your team, it is just like sort of separately. I would say like I love talking to people, which can just literally be talking or actively asking questions, but making choices of whether you choose to ask a question or not, so you can use that later, of, well, I asked all these questions and this is what you told me, so this is what I did. Or like, I'm not going to ask this question because then I won't know the answer for later if I don't want to ask this question, so that I don't have this answer for later. So like talking to people also, because sometimes like there is that usefulness of like the data and like what the rules are, but a lot of times people work outside of the rules, and like that sometimes can weirdly matter just as much. We're like, oh, like 75% of the higher ups function this way, which is different than what the handbook says, but like they're the higher ups, so I'm gonna do that.
Yeah.
So like trying to like talk to people, figure things out, get a little curious, but within your realm. Like it doesn't have to be about everything.
Yeah.
But it's so that you can function in the way that you want to have your impact to move forward. So like choose what that thing is, because you can't do it all at once. I've tried, it's too hard.
I love, oh my gosh. Well, first of all, I love what y'all said. What I really resonated with was like, yes, you have to build your Dumbledore's army, right? You do have to build your group of people. But then I would also say, you know, part of Mischief is the experimentation, right? So small experiments, small risks, small failures, small wins, like whatever test, do small tests. Every time you try to get attuned with somebody and be like, you know, do you really want to do this report? Because I don't want to do, like, you start to build up your people and be like, this is bullshit. You think it's bullshit? You know, and you start to, you build that community, but it's all within the experiments. And I think what happens and what you have to be careful about as a middle manager is the apathy. Is that it's going to take you over, that you after a while, because everyone else is keeping their heads down, that you're like, well, is that what I'm supposed to do? And don't fall for the malaise and the meh and the mailing it in, right? If you can, right? Because if you really want to be there, you really have to ask yourself, am I living my values during a work day? And when you're not, it's such a harder work day. That's when you start to burn out, because then you're just pretending to be someone that you're not. And that's what most people are doing. That's what a majority of people are doing, but that's not what you need to do. Okay. Oh my gosh, this was so good. Okay. So then how can people find out more about y'all if they want to get in touch with you because you're so dope?
Well, they can go to our website, thisusnow.com, or they can follow us on Instagram or Twitter or LinkedIn or Facebook, all of the socials. We'd love to have people come check us out.
And Lauren?
Same thing, because I also work with Maddie, but because I also sometimes work with you. I also have an additional website called cultivatorofcuriosity.com. You can find the This Us Now website on there as well, and socials are on there. I'm also, it's me, Lauren Yee, on many a platform. Hang out, I love to talk to people all the time.
And this is Jeff Harry with Rediscover Your Play. Find me at rediscoveryourplay.com or Jeff Harry Plays on all the things from TikTok to LinkedIn. Thank you very much, both of you. This has been a riveting conversation.